Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast, a show for people who are big on cities but short on time. I am Vanessa Quirk. Eric, did you see that video of the Spaniards on lockdown playing bingo from their balconies?
I did. This is a fantastic video and exactly what we need right now. But I think my question was, what do they win?
Oh man, some sort of kind of creation made from household items.
Right? What do you get if you win? Do you get to go outside?
Oh, no. I know. You get toilet paper.
You get toilet paper. There you go.
The stakes are high.
These are the times we're in. All right, city lovers. Welcome to the Sidewalk Weekly podcast. I'm Eric Jaffe. We'll spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing the biggest stories from the urban tech world this week. Our first segment looks at 3 top stories. We'll give them 5 minutes each. And when time's up, as always, you'll hear this little bicycle bell. Top stories this week, they're all about coronavirus. So we're going to talk about using data to help slow the spread. We're going to talk about the mental health impacts of quarantine. And we're going to talk about the role of urban design in fighting pandemics.
All right, let's get into it.
All right, so our top story this week, we look at the Washington Post, which reports that the U.S. government, the federal government, has been in talks with tech companies to potentially use smartphone location data as a way to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Now, we've seen Israel use this. I believe China has used similar methods. This does raise privacy concerns. So, there's a second component to this. In another piece this week in Recode, Sarah Morrison is reporting that she spoke to a lot of privacy advocates who said, actually, this is something that could be done in a privacy-preserving way. Mm-hmm. So, Vanessa, how do we do this right?
Right. Well, so let's just back up a second and just explain why this is an important conversation, right? So we know that people need to keep distance from each other right now. We've heard about the social distancing measures. We've heard about this rule about keeping 6 feet away from other people. And we also know that smartphones have a lot of location data that can show where people are at any moment, right? And potentially you could use those smartphones to show whether people are keeping the distance that is necessary to slow the spread of this virus. Now, this data can be aggregated, so it wouldn't show if you, the individual, are coming in touch with other people, but it would show in general, is crowding happening? And if crowding is happening in an unsafe manner, that health officials can kind of use that information and address, there's a hotspot here, there's a potential for transmission, or it has a potential to spread here, there, the other. And that's really important information for them to have at their fingertips at this moment of crisis.
Right. And I think, where the privacy concerns come in really is that we're at this moment also of having a really low faith in both government and, frankly, tech companies in terms of protecting this data. And I think that's kind of, how do you balance that privacy risk with the health benefits?
Right. This is the big question, right? Because, obviously other countries have tried to do this and they've done it in a way that people haven't felt was privacy preserving. I'm thinking about what's happening in China. There obviously were benefits to it. They were able to slow down the spread of the disease, but the question is kind of at what cost, or would it be in line with our values to do it that way? So this is a tricky conversation because obviously lives are at risk. So you need to be able to weigh both sides. But the kind of good thing is that the companies are saying that the data definitely can be anonymized and it definitely can be aggregated. So it would be that population level data, not that personal data. Now, the privacy advocates that Sarah Morrison spoke to, they weren't like rah, collect the data, but they were saying it is possible to collect this data in a privacy preserving way if you kind of do some things up front, right? So if you put in rules for what can be collected, right? And also make sure that there's accountability from the beginning so you know who's responsible for this data collection and how they're doing it. You could potentially have the data overseen by an independent party. Another kind of interesting solution that these advocates brought up is that you could constrict the collection for a strict time period, right? And then just kind of make sure that there are mechanisms in place so that it's not a step towards kind of more invasive data collection down the line, like some sort of database collection, right? And these are all things that if you're mindful, you can have in place from the beginning and hopefully kind of mitigate any potential privacy risks.
Yeah. And the really broader goal here is something that epidemiologists call contact tracing. And I've been following this a bit. My wife's a health reporter at the Times, as you know. She wrote about this morning in an editorial. But contact tracing, this has been used for many, many years. And really, you find people who have tested positive for the virus, and you find everyone they've been in contact with. And ideally you test them as well to see if they have it. And if so, you keep them isolated so they don't become a disease vector and pass this along. And that's really how China and South Korea have flattened their curves with the coronavirus. Now, technology adds a new element into this, especially smartphone data. The Washington Post report said there would not be contact tracing, I think because it's considered such an individual level data risk, I believe. It wasn't exactly clear. But I do think there are ways to do this that are not so invasive, right? You mentioned kind of population level data. Well, you could get data at the neighborhood level or at the block level. And if you found hotspots there, you could have health inspectors follow up at a more personal level in ways that were not, invasive of data. I think, that is possible. What it requires that America hasn't done so far is a lot more testing, because if you don't test those contacts, you don't know who has the virus. And therefore you have this risk that we're facing now of asymptomatic cases potentially being able to pass along the virus without even knowing it. So that's a real risk there.
Right. I mean, it definitely seems like if this is something that we can figure out, we should, because the benefits are clearly there. All right. Our second story comes from the Sidewalk Talk blog. So Eric wrote a blog this week looking into research that's been done recently all about the mental health impact of quarantine. So obviously cities right now are imposing restrictive lockdowns, and it's important to understand, what toll could this take for those who are stuck inside. So Eric, what are the big risks here?
Yeah, so a lot of this data comes from a great literature review done by psychologists at King's College London. They published it in the journal Lancet at the end of February. Journals, by the way, scientific journals have done a great job making this type of information open to the public at this time. Not closed off access. So I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. But these psychologists, they studied the response to people who were quarantined or who were isolated during really recent outbreaks like SARS, like MERS, like the swine flu. And these were kind of really restrictive measures, in some ways more restrictive than we're seeing today. Even lockdowns in, say, like California, you're allowed to go out for a walk. These were real quarantines. You really weren't allowed to leave. So that caveat is in place because it's not a one-to-one comparison with today always. But we are seeing more restrictive measures around the world. So it is a reasonable analogy. And the truth is, there definitely was a toll for people, and it's one we have to keep in mind. Now, for most people, it was mild, right? We know this. We think about going stir crazy, right? There was boredom, there was frustration, there's, kind of general anxiety, there's some loneliness going on there, right?
General anxiety struck a chord there, yeah.
These are natural feelings, and for the most part, they're mild. Now, there are some populations who do develop kind of much more severe signs, things like PTSD, things like depression. Health workers in particular, there is such high stress right now, and they're so vital right now that they kind of tended to suffer more, according to these studies. And some of these impacts could last for months or even years. So there really is this mental toll that we have to account for, both now and potentially afterwards with support programs.
Definitely. I mean, one of the studies that you mentioned that I thought were quite interesting, it looked specifically at parents and how parents were responding to the quarantine. And it seemed like it was more difficult for them than non-parents. That said, it did seem like when you were talking about how extreme this quarantine was that these studies were studying, there was a level of kind of separation from your children, which of course would lead to kind of a more severe mental health outcome. Right. So, but that was really interesting to me. And I think one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is how parents are dealing with the virus right now in quarantine. But I mean, that extreme case aside, you did write that even for the general population, there are some factors that can, lessen the severity of the impact. So can you kind of unpack those for us?
There were a few really clear factors, and they make sense, but they're good to note. One was duration, right? How long is the quarantine or the isolation? So there was a study of people quarantined in Toronto during the SARS outbreak of 2003, and it found that the people who were quarantined more than 10 days had significantly greater links to PTSD symptoms than those who are quarantined less than 10 days. Now, that doesn't mean 10 days is like some magic number. There's not enough data to say that.
I think I'm on day 10 today. So.
I know, right? It feels like year 5, really. But it is, of course, really good to know that the longer, the tougher, right?
Yeah.
I think another big one was financial strain. Again, not surprising, of course, but if you weren't sure you could have work or pay your rent or pay your bills, this added to the anxiety while you were quarantined. And so that speaks to the importance of some of the fiscal stimulus packages we're seeing in terms of sending money directly to workers, directly to small businesses that are impacted. And so I think one final measure was very clear leadership. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it obvious to people? Is it clear to people why such extreme measures are needed? Are there exceptions like you can go outside for a walk? You can play bingo on your balcony. Are there things that people can do to kind of ease this pain?
And I would note, of some of the things that you can do to ease the pain are, also kind of obvious, but, reaching out to friends and loved ones virtually. And I've been seeing some really wonderful stories of neighbors kind of mobilizing using Facebook groups to make sure they're helping people who can't leave their home right now. And those are the kinds of things that can really, I think, have an impact on people's mental health if you feel supported, if you feel part of a community. And this is especially important for kind of more vulnerable populations. And there was a great story from a company called Umbrella, which is a portfolio company of ours, all about kind of thinking about older populations right now who historically already suffer from kind of loneliness more than the average population. So reaching out to those people right now is really critical, I think.
All right, on to our final top story of the week. We're going to stick with the topic of quarantine, and it's a story from Curbed by Diana Buds. She's writing that throughout history, cities, urban neighborhoods, they've been designed to kind of defend us from the spread of disease, right? Through distancing. We moved away from that for a long time, but now it's coming back again with COVID-19. So Vanessa, will urban design change in this new age of pandemics?
Maybe is the answer. But this article was really interesting, and I do want to back up a little bit to kind of get into some of the interesting details that Diana uncovered in this piece, right? So she kind of goes through a little historical journey of all the ways that we have used physical distance in our built environment to help prevent the spread of disease. She goes back to the Middle Ages when we first kind of established this idea of quarantine in Venice, when the boats coming back from the Black Plague had to stay in the harbor for 40 days, hence the term quarantine. But kind of away from that isolated incident, she kind of starts talking about cities themselves, right? And so there's lots of examples from history that she brings up in a little bit more recent history in the Middle Ages, but think about the cholera outbreak in London in the 1850s, right?
Right. This is the famous Jon Snow map.
Yes, the original OG Jon Snow, not of Game of Thrones fame. Yes, OG Jon Snow was the one who figured out that cholera was being spread through water, right? And that led to a sanitary reform movement. And that also led to the idea of, drinking water and sewage infrastructure. And so our streets are actually completely different because of that, right? We have straight, smooth, wide streets. Why? Because that's what you need to install underground pipe systems, but also because, when they're straight and smooth, it's easier to wash them down. So that is kind of an implication that we live with today that came from an anti-disease spreading measure, which is interesting, right? And so there's lots of examples of that she brings up that are really fascinating and really impact the way that cities were just laid out in general.
Right. And you're thinking about the same time period here in the U.S., you kind of see that with some of the landscape architecture and big park movements of the time, right? You have Frederick Law Olmsted here in New York. He was actually a sanitary officer during the Civil War, and he convinced New York City health officials, to design and build Central Park in the middle of Manhattan. At the time, obviously, going back to the Commissioner's Grid of 1811, Manhattan was designed with no parks, really. They felt people could get as much nature as they needed from the Hudson River, from the East River. They didn't make room for parks. And so Olmsted was trying to kind of correct that oversight, knowing, or at least had a premonition, which we know now, that green space has a really positive impact both on mental health and physical health.
Right. And I would just note that, Olmsted did, with Central Park, they did demolish a lot of existing neighborhoods, which were, generally inhabited by people of color. And that is an unfortunate kind of common thread in this kind of study of disease and health in cities. You think about the so-called slum clearance efforts that were often used public health rhetoric in order to kind of justify that. So this does have a long history in cities. But one of the things that Diana Buds brings up is that once we started to have antibiotics and vaccines to fight infectious disease throughout the 20th century, this rhetoric kind of became less important, especially in terms of the physical layout of our cities, right? The antibiotics and the vaccines were much more important towards limiting the spread of disease. Until now, basically. We don't have a vaccine yet for COVID-19. Right. And so now the question is like, well, do we go back to using design to encourage more physical distance, which is it kind of goes against everything we think about when we think about how cities should be designed.
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting ways that we might approach that Diana brings up in the article. This is an idea from Michelle Acuto of the University of Melbourne, just kind of thinking of, digital infrastructure as kind of the modern equivalent to, say, the type of civil engineering that occurred during John Snow's day in the 19th century, right? So instead of sewage systems, you're talking about connectivity, internet systems to make sure that, everyone can receive the proper alerts. Everyone can receive the proper communications from leadership, right? We know how important that was going back to our last segment. So could this be the modern equivalent of that?
Yeah, and there's also in the article an interesting conversation about, could digital infrastructure start entering our homes and apartments in a way that could help disease prevention. So Jeff Mana and Nicola Twilley, they're writing a book on quarantine right now. And, Jeff Mana says maybe a smart home could read your temperature and know if you can't go out into the shared parts of an apartment building. I mean, it sounds a little dystopian and crazy, but could be helpful. We were talking the other day about, autonomous vehicles potentially becoming more prominent in a world of pandemics because you need to get around without coming in touch with people. Could your AV have sensors in a similar way? So it's an interesting thought experiment. Don't know if we're actually going to see much change in the immediate future, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, that is it for the top stories. And as always, you can find the links to these stories in the podcast episode notes. In our next segment, we're going to talk with reporter Jennifer Omani in Madrid, one of the European cities currently on lockdown. Back in a sec. Okay, we are now joined by reporter Jennifer Omani, calling in from Madrid. Spain has been one of the European countries most affected by coronavirus, and it's taking severe measures for containment. So right now, the city's on lockdown, and so that means you can only go out if you are getting groceries or medicine. So Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Vanessa. Thanks for having me.
Jennifer, we're so glad to have you on. I was wondering if you could explain what the rules are right now of the lockdown in Madrid and in Spain, and how the local government's been communicating those rules. As we read about it here in the U.S., it sounds like there's some confusion around who's an essential worker, who's allowed to be outside. Can you tell us how that's working?
So there was some vague wording in the initial announcement of the lockdown, but that's been really clarified over the last few days. And now we have really some of the harshest measures in Europe. The government's been communicating that obviously online, on TV, on radio, and via social media. But they're also very much communicating that in the street by the really heavy police presence that we have here. Police circulating all the time in vehicles and stopping people for just walking down the street, basically, and checking where they're going.
And obviously, this is a really big change for people. Whoever can, I'm sure everyone is working from home if you have a job that allows for that. Some people probably can't be working at all right now if their job doesn't allow for that. So how are you hearing from people that transition is going so far?
Well, Spain was not a sort of knowledge economy country that was used to large scale working from home. And obviously everyone is adapting as best they can. But Spain has a lot of manufacturing and small artisanal businesses, and they've obviously been very badly hit. And there's some cases, a guy I spoke to who is a leather worker, for example, who was just trying to buy bread on his bike. And because he was riding a bike, the police pulled him over and fined him. And he's already not made any money this month. He's really worrying about how he's going to keep going.
It sounds like the police are the main mechanism here for making sure that people follow the rules then.
Yes, because they tried, as I think you saw with France, they did not have such a heavy police presence, and quite a lot of people had just carried on as normal. So this police presence then really ramped up.
So Jennifer, how are people getting around then? I mean, they're not sure about the rules in some cases. Obviously, some folks are essential workers, care workers. If grocery stores are open, those workers have to show up. Are people using the transit system? How is kind of the general, what we take for granted as the day-to-day movement? How's that happening?
Yeah, so the transit system is still running, but at extremely reduced capacity. So there were some images of really packed commuter trains on Monday, but the government has now enforced a 1 meter distancing rule there as well. Private cars are not allowed to have passengers. Taxis can only have one passenger to keep that distance, and buses are running. But again, you need a really good reason to take them without falling foul of the police. And bikes are very much viewed with suspicion. So all the rentable bikes have been taken off the street.
So one thing that I've been curious about, Jennifer, is, I mean, I've been to Spain before. My parents actually live there as well. So I'm quite familiar with the amazing plaza culture that you guys have in Madrid. Obviously now that isn't possible anymore, but I have seen a lot of videos kind of similar to Italy of Spaniards taking to their balconies, playing games with each other, singing songs. So I'm kind of curious, how are you seeing people remaining social despite all of the interruptions to daily life?
Yeah, so as you'll know, public services here, like public parks, children's play areas, there's stuff absolutely everywhere, especially for kids. And them being inside is challenging for people who are also trying to work from home and worrying about their finances. But, there is an amazing community spirit. So that's really been taken off the terraces and onto the balconies, I might say. So far this week, I've seen the sort of nightly applause and cheers for health workers that happens every night here at 8 p.m. I've done a workout via Zoom. And on Saturday, there's a plan for a big balcony party. So people are just going to take their drinks onto their balconies and sort of celebrate with their neighbors. It's still try to have something of a weekend. It just is a big contrast for me being British with London. I saw a woman in a video trying to start a sing-along in London and nobody joined in. So here, there's this real kind of communal spirit.
All right, Jennifer, last one, and we'll let you go here. We're seeing other cities and other countries taking these more severe measures. France, obviously, as well. In America, the Bay Area is pretty much on lockdown with people staying in their homes for the most part. Is there anything that Madrid is doing, that Spain is doing right or particularly effectively that other cities around the world could learn from right now?
Right. So I think the thing I've noticed that happened very quickly is people mobilizing fast to identify who's vulnerable in their local community and make sure that they're getting taken care of, that people are doing groceries for them and leaving them outside their door. They're making sure that those people have somebody to call if they're getting symptoms, while also maintaining these strict distancing measures, but making sure that nobody gets left behind. There was an amazing video of a woman, her block celebrating, or her apartment block, I should say, celebrating her birthday and sort of playing music from the floor above and leaving a piece of cake outside her door and so on. So it's, while respecting the measures, just making sure that people aren't feeling isolated, because loneliness can also kill. And especially in Spain, where there's so many old people, it's been so important to make sure that they're taking care of those people. And I feel like Spaniards really have stepped up for that.
Well, thank you for joining us, and stay safe, Jennifer.
Thank you. You too.
It is now time for our final segment, Last Smile. This is the segment where we set aside the depressing news of the week and focus on something happy for a minute each.
These are getting tougher and tougher.
I know. But we still have to focus on that something happy. It's very important. Eric, what made you smile this week?
We dug deep and we found something to smile about this week. Mine was a story by Daniel Miller in the LA Times. He's writing about how one of the few silver linings of this outbreak right now is actually that drive-in movie theaters, they're having a moment, right? Drive-ins, it sounds like, in California. There's also ones in the middle of the U.S., Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri. They're all seeing, big spikes in terms of more people coming and wanting to see a drive-in movie. It's a great distraction amid all this anxiety. It could help the movie business during a tough time. And it kind of gives you this sense of being together, even though you're still apart in a safe way, in terms of being separated in our cars, and yet we're still kind of together at the drive-in movie theater. So, it's something I think to smile about this week.
Okay. All right. Alone yet together at the drive-in movie theater. That's all right. Yeah, I could get it behind that.
All right, Vanessa, what did you find that made you smile this week?
Okay, also another kind of silver lining of the coronavirus. And we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but this idea of people really rallying to help one another, which is a kind of always the opportunity in the crisis. The best of people can come out, the worst as well, but sometimes the best, which is really nice to see. There's a really sweet story in the BBC this week about kind Canadians starting a, quote, caremongering trend, which again, of course, yeah, I love the wordplay too. So I got to give them props for that. So obviously we feel like there's been a lot of scaremongering happening. And one of the organizers, Valentina Harper, she says, scaremongering is a big problem. We wanted to switch that around and get people to connect on a positive level, to connect with each other. It's spread the opposite of panic in people. It's brought out community and camaraderie and allowed us to tackle the needs of those who are at risk all the time, now more than ever. And that's just kind of a beautiful sentiment that I think is important to keep in mind as things feel anxious. Other people are looking out for each other. I think that's important to keep in mind.
We are all in this together right now.
Definitely. Alone yet together.
Alone yet together. All right, well, our time is up this week. Thank you for joining us.
If you want to read the stories that we discussed today and many more, then you should definitely sign up for the Sidewalk Weekly newsletter at sidewalklabs.com.
We should note that the views expressed in the Sidewalk Weekly don't necessarily reflect Sidewalk Labs' company position.
And if you think we're missing a perspective, then please let us know. Send us an email with a voice memo to podcast@sidewalklabs.com, and we may just talk about it in a future episode. The Sidewalk Weekly is produced by me, Vanessa Quirk, and Eric Jaffe. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Zach McNeese.
Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions, and our art is by the great Tim Cow. See you next time.
Stay safe, everybody.